This is a brief presentation on sensations and perceptions for Introduction to Psychology at Helena College, University of Montana. This presentation is just meant to give a quick brief overview of the studies of sensations and perceptions. Students are encouraged to read thoroughly through the chapter, understand the different sensation processes and organs related to the sensation system, specifically the visual system and the auditory system, and how those systems work in tandem with each other to create this thing we call perceptions. This lecture will just give a brief overview of the different topics within sensation and perceptions and to give a introductory understanding of the study. First, we should look at some terminology, and that is the difference between a sensation and a perception and why they're studied differently. First, sensation is a process of receiving information, and when we talk about receiving information, we're talking about information from our five senses, information that hits against a receptor nerve and then is transduced into a electrical chemical signal and sent via to the brain. Perceptions, on the other hand, is the process of organizing and interpreting those sensations. A related term that kind of bridges the process of sensations and perceptions is the term of transduction. Transduction is related to a sensation process of transforming physical energy into electrical chemical information. From a philosophical perception, the study of sensations and perceptions comes from the philosophical question: if a tree falls in the wood with no one around, does that tree really exist? Now, as a student or even just as an individual, we can close our eyes and we can envision a tree falling, and we can envision that tree making sound. And we go, yes, of course that tree exists because there's millions of trees in the world. I can visualize that tree, and I can visualize a tree, and I can imagine somewhere in the world there's a tree that exists that is falling in the woods. And we go, of course it's reality, and of course it exists. But when we look at the other side of the argument, we see that if something is not in existence that can record the existence of that event, then how do we know of its existence? So the study of sensations and perceptions is the study of the receiving of objective stimuli, things that are actually occurring outside of our psychological being, which we call sensations, and then interpreting that information so that it makes sense to us, that we can call this a perception. Now, in literal terms, if we take a rationalist approach, we would say, no, the tree does not exist because there's nothing there to sense it, and nothing exists without a sensation receiving organism that can record and interpret that information. From a different perspective, we all would say, wait, no, it can exist because it exists. Because we know from contemplation and what we know about forests and what we know about the way the world works, there's trees that fall, and so yes, we can know that a tree falls in the forest. This is where we come to the argument of where does reality really exist? Is reality these things that are outside of us? Or is reality something we construct within our mind? And the conclusion of sensations and process and perception research is that reality is something that is created and constructed within the mind. Today we say within the brain. And that everything is not a direct reflection of the actual sensations that we're receiving. And we will look at many examples throughout this course where the objective exterior reality does not equal our experience of that reality. And we can even look at it from very objective laws and rules we know about the universe. So if we take one of the most basic concepts of physics and the transfer of energy, where one object colliding with another object will have an equal equal response, right? And so the question is that energy is transferred in some way. That's a law. There's rules. There's math equations that show this law to exist in a consistent fashion every single time. However, our experience determines how we understand how that law works and how that law operates. So, for example, in a Western setting where we're very individualistic and we believe that our existence has its own energy and its own being, what we say in that law is it's the transfer of one energy in an object to the transfer of the energy into the next object. However, if we went to a collective culture such as Japan or China and asked them to interpret that same basic physics law, they would say that there is no transfer of energy from one object to the next. What they would talk about is the interplay of energy that is between those two objects that causes that reaction. That an object in and of itself does not contain energy, but there is energy between those two objects. Now, this comes from a collective experience where the individual is not emphasized, where the individual object is nothing unless it's put in the context of its situation. And so relationships between objects interpret that law. So that's an example from physics where we have very specific mathematical equations that we call a law, but that law can even be interpreted differently based on how our mind constructs reality. And that's important to keep in mind as we move forward. Now, when we talk about sensations and perceptions, we talk about top down and bottom up processing. And usually when we talk about top down processing, we talk about how our perceptions, or what we can call our expectations, influence how we receive information from the sensation system. And we'll get to an example of priming to elaborate on that process. The bottom-up process is a process through sensations, where sensations influence our interpretation or our perception. And we'll talk about that in the context of subliminal stimulation. So when we talk about subliminal stimulation, we're talking about stimulation that is presented at a minimal threshold to where our perception system doesn't quite pick up on it, but it is influencing our perception, okay? And probably the biggest example of subliminal stimulation is the idea of subliminal messaging, okay? And how does subliminal messaging work? So in the early days of subliminal, they used to say, they put a word just under the threshold of consciousness that says, buy more candy bars, or buy more Coke, buy more Coke. and they would play these tracks in the grocery store to see if that subliminal message will influence the buying behavior. And what a lot of this research on subliminal stimulation suggests is no, it doesn't. Okay, that if you in a rock and roll song, if it tells you to go kill your parents, you're not going to go kill your parents. That should be good news for some parents that have kids that enjoy that type of music and might have those subliminal messages. But no, you can't be told to buy more Coca-Cola. You can't be told to worship the devil, those types of things, because what we have found is that subliminal messaging does not influence our behavior and cognitive states, so our rational frontal cortical states of decision making and semantic understanding. But what subliminal messages do influence is our emotional state. Okay, and so, for example, if in a subliminal message it says, you're handsome and you're good looking. Okay, those are emotional laden statements. Okay, because they make us feel good. Okay, well, in that case, that subliminal message won't influence our cognitive evaluation of how good we look or whatnot, but it will stimulate the same emotion as when we do feel like we're good looking or whatever. So let's give an example of how subliminal messaging could be used in marketing to increase the sales of a product. Well, if you walk into, let's say, a grocery store and they have a subliminal message that says, today is a good day, everybody is happy, you are happy, blah, 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 those happy, valent words then will help place you in a happy mood. And then you come across a sign that says Pepsi, only happy people buy Pepsi, or happy people enjoy Pepsi. In that context, you are more likely to buy that Pepsi. Now, how do big companies use this kind of subliminal messaging alone? You can actually do a little bit of an experiment on your own. Here's what I want you to do. Now, I know in our little town of Helena, the music they play, the managers just kind of put on whatever they want to. I was told our Walmart isn't a good example of this, but if you're visiting a big city, most of the Walmarts and the big stores use music that the corporation asked them to, okay? And what they do in those situations, for example, Walmarts who follow the music that the corporation wants them to follow will play music that was done in the later 80s into the 90s, okay? Because that music is associated with what their target marketing groups age when they were in their childhood. And our association with music and childhood brings about good emotions. So Walmart's target group are individuals who are in their 30s to their 50s. That's who they want to get in their store because that's the group that tends to spend the most money. So they play music from the 80s and into the 90s because that's when those individuals were in their youth and the majority of them were at their happiest. And so that happy mood then promotes buying more product from that store. You will notice stores like Hot Topics and all of those play music that is congruent with their target population's youthful age. Okay, so how can you test this? So what I would encourage you to do is if you know your store uses the proper music and the manager doesn't take free will on what's being played, is I would go to your favorite store and I would use headphones and listen to something contemporary and today. And one week I would listen to the store music. The next week I would listen to the contemporary. Then you kind of see what I'm getting at, and then compare how much you spend. And you will find, and this is kind of what studies on this stuff finds, is you'll spend anywhere from 20 to 40% less in that store by not listening to the music that that store is playing, if they're playing according to their marketer's recommendations. So this is an influence from our sensation system, which is influencing our perceptions. Because perceptually, we don't know that these things are going on. All we're aware of is that I'm in a store, my mood seems to be uplifted, and that promotes buying more product from that store. So that's a bottom-up process. Now, what's an example of a top-down process? This we can look at what we call a priming effect. Okay, so this is actually an example of one of the research that I was first involved in my the beginning of my psychology career. Is we used a picture that is presented right here, and this is kind of what we did. We did what's called a two-phase research, where the first phase participants were told had nothing to do with the second phase. So after they were done with the first research, they basically didn't need to remember it, they didn't need to think about it, but then they were asked to participate in a totally separate research thing. So in the first research phase, we told students that we were just wanted to know about how reading something influences physical activity. And so we randomly assigned people to two groups. One group read a short story about the great outdoors, camping, fishing, those types of things. The second group read a story about inner city life, about homelessness, those types of things. And so they had these two different stories, and then we had them go do some physical activity, and we played like we were actually measuring something. And then after they were done with that, we said, hey, while you're here, do you mind participating in another research project? You can get a little bit more credit for your instructor, those types of things. And a majority of them would, get a few more points or a couple dollars. And we brought them into this other room. And basically what we said is we're going to present this image you see on this slide. And we're going to do it for 2 seconds. That's enough time to receive all the information necessary. And then after the presentation of the slide, we simply want you to write down what you saw. And so we did this. We presented this picture that you see on the slide, and then had them write down what they saw. And we noticed that there was a stark difference between the individuals who read the inner city story versus the individuals who read the outdoor stories. The people who read the inner city story, where you see that fire there, they saw one of those homeless barrels that has fire in it that you see on the TV. The guy holding the cup was holding a gun. A lot of guys were wearing hoodies. They failed to recognize the dog. They did recognize the bricks, but they recognized gang members, those types of things. Individuals who read the earlier story about being in the great outdoors accurately kind of showed this picture. They recognized the dog, the guy holding a cup, they recognized the campfire, all of those types of things. Now here's an unrelated event that influenced the interpretation of the exact same picture. And this is a top-down influence. It's our expectations of what we should see or what we should experience influences what we see and experience. Probably the most common priming effect that we all experience is if we all have a drive to work, right? And there's some mornings where, we get cut off in traffic, there's a delay, we might spill our coffee on them, and we go, oh, geez, this is going to be a crappy day. And sure enough, what happens? We end up interpreting and experiencing a crappy day, even though that day probably is no real difference than any other day other than that one experience coming to work. This is what we call a priming effect. We will talk about the priming effect a lot when we get into cognition and decision making. In this, it's priming has a clear influence on how and what we see in our world. And dependent upon what our expectations are, I'm going to use this as a noun again, our brain will create that reality for us, which can also create mistakes and unfortunately sometimes can lead to some major mistakes. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about the different sensation systems, about receiving information. If you notice on this slide, we have 5 different types of cells that are sensory receptor cells. We have our vision, we have hearing, we have smell, we have taste, touch, and free nerve endings. Those are touched in the mesenteric corpuscles. I want to talk about these sensing cells in 3 different type of categories. Okay, the first category is photoreceptor cells, which are responsible for our visual system. Photoreceptors receive different lengths of light wave and then transfer that into an electrical impulse through transduction. So our vision is what we call a photoreceptor. Mechanoreceptors are for hearing, touch, and pressure. This is where there's a mechanical process. So in our hearing, what happens is different pressures of air, waves of air, push against different hair-like receptors within the hearing system, which then causes a electrical impulse. So different waves of air mechanically trigger different hairs in the hearing system. Touch and pressure work the same way. When we feel heat, for example, that mechanical pressure or that damage ignites different types of cells. Chemoreceptors are smell and taste. This is a chemical reaction. So when certain chemicals hit certain receptors, it creates a different nerve impulse. Now, I'll have to admit, this kind of sometimes grosses me out. When I smell a bad smell, there's actually a chemical on me that is creating that smell. That's kind of disturbing, but that's kind of the idea, is that that's a chemical reaction when it comes to smell and taste. Now, when it comes to all of this receiving of information, the study of the receiving of information is something we call psychophysics. Psychophysics is basically the study of how the sensation system feels or receives information. Okay, and there's about 4 different things that we look at when we're talking about psychophysics, and one is the absolute threshold. And what absolute threshold is the minimum amount of stimuli necessary for a nerve cell to detect that stimuli. The second concept is noise, or what we call interference. And our sensation system is actually pretty remarkable, especially our visual system. I want you to think about this, and I believe in your book it gives the length, but I want you to think about this for a second. When it comes to visual system and how acute our visual system actually is, I want you to think we can see technically a candle flickering from approximately 30 miles away. Now think about that. How acute our visual system has to be able to detect a stimulus that small from that far away. And I want you to think about, why is it though we can't actually experience that? And the answer is because the only way we really can see that from 30 miles away is because of noise. In order to see that candlelight, what we would need to do is eliminate all of the different noise. We would need to put you in basically a 30-mile vacuum that has no pollution in it, does not have other light interference, that has nothing that interferes with your acute visual system. And that requires about a 30-mile vacuum. But that's just how detailed our visual system is if we didn't have all of the visual, as we would say, junk getting in the way or noise. We talked about subliminal perceptions, and then we talked about differences threshold. Differences threshold is the minimal amount of stimulus to detect the differences between the same stimulus at least 50% of the time. So if we're talking about color, how much does it take to notice one shade of red with another shade of red? At least 50% of the time. I'm not going to go into great detail about Weber's law. It's kind of an example of what psychophysics kind of found. I'm just going to spend just a minute on this slide. Is what Weber wanted to know is how much does it take to notice a difference in stimulation. So if I have a 5 pounds and I add, how much more weight does it take for me to be able to detect that change in weight? Okay. And what Weber found, and why it's kind of important, is what Weber found is it's not based on the amount of change, it's based on the percentage of change. So why is this important? Well, if we take weight, which changes at about a 5% rate, okay, and let's take two people who are trying to lose weight. And we have a person who weighs 300 pounds versus a person who weighs 100 pounds. Well, how much does it take each person to detect that they actually lose weight? Okay. Well, according to the slide, weight change, in order to notice the change in weight, you have to have a 5% change. What does this mean? So for the 100-pound person, they have to lose 5 pounds to actually feel that change in weight. However, for the 300-pound person, they need to lose 15 pounds to feel the same amount of weight lost, or to feel the change of weight. Now, this is good information, right? Because if you're a 300-pound person, it takes quite a while to lose weight. But if you know that you're not going to even notice that you've lost weight until you've lost about 15 pounds, you can kind of feel a little bit better about your weight loss program if you notice on the scale you're only losing 2 or 3 pounds per week, but you don't feel it. While Weber law is what tries to explain that, is it's not the amount, it is the percentage. I'm just going to get into perceptions for just a minute and how we construct our reality and whatnot. And the majority of the research on perceptions has come from Gestalt principles. Gestalt is German for configuration or form. Now, the difference between Gestalt psychology and what we would say the other psychologies, such as psychoanalysis or behaviorism or any of the other ones, is what the Gestalt individuals are going to say is that the whole is more important than the sum of its parts. Most of science is what we call a reductionist science, meaning that we want to reduce it to its most basic elements. And so when we study, for example, behavior from a behavioral perspective, we separate a stimulus, a response, and a reward. And we say that those are 3 separate, distinct processes that can be reduced to their individual components. What Gestalt individuals would say is no, it is the entire picture starting from beginning to end which makes sense of the world. And why Gestalt psychology has had such an influence on perceptions is because we often take the whole to deduce to its sums, meaning that our perception system isn't designed to give details, it's designed to give us an overall picture or an overall view. It's designed to fill in gaps to help us understand our world. So, for example, we look at this picture, and a lot of individuals see a young lady, and a few individuals see an older lady. Now, you can pause the video and really try and figure this out, but there's some people that can see both. And what we find, again, if we look at priming effect, if I go back and look at who you interacted with, if you interacted with mostly young ladies over the past couple weeks, you're most likely to only see the young lady. If you've interacted with elderly individuals and elderly women, you'll find it very easy to find the elderly woman in this picture. If I measured that you mixed with both, you'd be able to adjust your eyes and squint a little and see both. Again, we're looking at this from a Gestalt perspective. We're not breaking down individuals' lines, we're creating an overall picture. There are